So it's great to have Tom and be able to share the stage with you, Tom, today. So I'm going to speak up front for 15, 20 minutes or so, and then we'll segue. I've got some questions for Tom that have also come up from some of your responses of the emails I sent out for any questions. So we had quite a bit of response from that. And if we've got time at the end, we'll open up for broader questions. And like Jamie said, Jamie and Tom are going to be monitoring any questions or comments that come through as well. So with that said, I'm the first part that I'm going to talk about. If any of you saw me speak in Perth, Adelaide, or Melbourne recently, I'm going to be covering some of a similar concept, same concept. So you'll get the benefit of repetition, which is always handy for embedding. When I promoted this webinar with the title Tricky People, somebody came back to me and said, are you going to be talking about how to deal with yourself being a tricky person? And I went back and I responded, I'd be here all night if I was talking about how to navigate myself. And it was a good reminder that to some degree, all of us are tricky. The people we deal with, people who have to deal with us. It puts us all on a similar platform. And what that's good is for empathy. And I know that when I'm coaching and leading people, I often have to remember that, I have my own challenges as well. And while this person might be tricky, I face up to the fact that I'm tricky as well, as a leader, as a manager, whatever role we're in. One of the questions that came through this week was on the whole area of motivation. And the question from a business owner was, how do I help my people not lose motivation? Now, I've been working in consulting, coaching, business improvement, leadership development, executive coaching for the best part of 15 years. And this one question, how do I motivate my people, is the most predominant question I ever get asked. And so about 18 months ago, I decided to do some study. I had some answers and my own thoughts about it, but I thought I need to dig deep into this motivation theory and understand it more. So for 3 months, I deep dived for about 2 to 3 hours, very early every morning. The earliest paper I read on motivation theories and behaviorism was, I think it was 1896. All the way through to the current day. And I read volumes of books and research papers, empirical studies done on the whole motivation. And it covered from the workplace right the way through to in the laboratory with scientists, with rats and pigeon and mice and turtles, etc., pigeons. And it was an in-depth dive into the understanding of motivation. I was going to write a book on it, but since studying it, I'm not going to. It's taken a whole other side of things. But at the same time, I had one of my neighbors, I was out talking to him. He said to me, do you realize that your garden is the talk of the street? I was blown away in a good way. My garden was, very good. And he said to me, or I thought, I didn't mean to show everybody up. All I did was provided the right conditions in order for my lawns and plants to thrive. And I found out what they needed, and I worked with the plant to help it flourish. Around the same time, I was looking at my roses, and I thought to myself, I never wish my roses had more motivation to grow. I never wish they were more motivated. And I never yell at my roses or command them to produce better or perform more highly. All I have to do is create the right conditions in order for them to flourish. And it gave me a solid understanding of when we're working with people and how to bring the best out of them. If we liken them to a garden, really part of our role as managers, as leaders, as business owners is helping them and for us to provide the right conditions in order for them to thrive. So one of the scientists I followed and read some of his works and papers was a guy by the name of Skinner, B.F. Skinner. You might have heard of the Skinner box that he created. And I'd like to just share my screen with you and just share a couple of quotes from him. So he said, now I've got everybody over there. I'm going to move everyone down there. So he says, we are concerned then with the causes of human behavior. Now, remember, this guy studied rats and pigeons and mice, turtles. We are concerned then with the causes of human behavior. We want to know why men behave, women behave as they do. Any condition or event which can be shown to have an effect upon behavior must be taken into account. By discovering and analysing these causes, we can predict behaviour. To the extent that we can manipulate them or adjust those causes, we can control behaviour. He also went on to say, sorry, I'm having to adjust these. For some reason, this isn't working. And that's not good. I'm going to stop sharing for a minute. And I'm going to go back to share. Technology is not my greatest area of expertise, that's for sure. So he also said, by eliminating some conditions, holding others constant and varying others in an orderly manner, basic lawful relations could be established, essentially between the conditions that people live under and their varying behaviour. Around the same time, so all of this is happening with the gardens and the reading and the research, and I wanted to try to codify what I was doing in my behavioural change work that I was doing with leaders and people. And so I created this next slide, and this is what I'd like to just spend a little bit of time on. So I would ask just that you're free to share this within the workplace. Just don't pop it up online because it may end up in a book sometime. Publishers don't typically like seeing what you're putting in a book already having been published. But I wanted to share it with you today because I think this is a powerful piece of understanding of simplifying things, if you will. So we've got cause and effect. We won't go into the variable side of it, but cause and effect. So on the left-hand side, we've got the personal domain and the work domain. So in our personal worlds, we've got areas that make up us, the wonderful you, the wonderful me. So we've got how we think, how we act, our DNA, our relationships, our finances, our health, our skill sets, etc. Then we turn up to work and we enter into another domain, the work domain. We have conditions there, the conditions of employment, our pay, what we get paid, our colleagues, the customers we engage with, the workspace, whether it's clean, tidy, conducive to productivity, or whether it's on the flip side of that and not, and messy. So we've got all of these conditions that we're having to deal with on a daily basis. And what I've come to through my study and my work with people is that these conditions can give rise to interfering states that affect job performance, the effect. So in my work, when I get called in, a business owner will sometimes call me up and say, hey, Johnny's, I need him to perform more highly. His productivity's down 50%. Could you help him? Job performance. Now, I don't know anything else. I don't know anything about their personal world, what they're up to and what's affecting them at work. I don't even know the interfering state. So I'm working with a productivity, and I share this because you as managers, you as leaders, business owners, oftentimes the only thing we have to go on at the start is somebody is not performing, or they've dropped in their performance, or we notice they're struggling at a behavioral level, at a performance level. And I'd like to share a story. If you can just kind of lock that in your brain, and I'll just stop the sharing for a moment. So I work with a girl, and let's call her Jennifer. So a business that I'd been working with for a couple of years, and I had had various engagements with the senior management team. He phones me up one day and he says, I've got a really good person here, and she's just really struggling, and I'd like you to call in and give us some support while you're working with the others. And I said to him, I said, what's the issue? And he said, well, I'm not quite sure, but he said there's sometimes she sits with her hands in her head on the desk, and sometimes she just can't work for quite a while, for an hour or a couple of hours. Sometimes she has to go home or go for a walk. And he said, she's a great person. We really believe in her. We want to support her. Would you do that? And one of the lines, this was a takeaway line for me. He said, it's one thing for us to say we support people, but it's a whole other thing to do it. So anyway, Jennifer and I started a journey together. And that interfering state, that red circle there, I quickly found out was overwhelm. So she would get to the point where sometimes she was so overwhelmed that I think in her words, it was like her brain fused together. She found it really, really difficult to work. As we did the journey together, we started talking about conditions. And so to her credit, she started adjusting some of those variables. One of the things she did was started to get up at 5 a.m. and have breakfast. That was a condition that helped her perform more highly and addressed some of the overwhelm. She started eliminating or minimizing some of the negative relationships she had in her life. She started bringing some more order into her personal world. And to her credit, she went to a doctor and had a chat there and got some medication, again, to help address the overwhelm. So that was in the personal domain. In the work domain, she was quite an ordered, process, structured person. And her job role was on the front line with customers and constant calls and emails. And then she'd have technicians badgering her for work and different things. And sometimes it was all too much and very stressful, which added to that overwhelm. The other thing was her desk. She was too close sometimes in with colleagues and just needed to breathe a little bit more. So to the manager's credit and the business owner at this company, they made these adjustments. They changed the conditions and worked with Jennifer to help in this process to minimize that interfering state of overwhelm. And over a period of 6 to 8 months, from what I understood, that sense of overwhelm reduced significantly. I can't remember. I think there was the odd day, but compared to where she'd come from to where it was then, it had minimized and performance accelerated. Now, we didn't go into into the mind and the emotions. All we did was sought to change some of the conditions over on the cause side. It affected the interfering state and it increased performance. So much so, I phoned the manager, her manager, after I finished with her a couple of months after. I said, how's she going? He said, she's the least of my problems. So it was a really good journey to go on. And it was a very powerful insight into how things at work and things at home can dramatically affect and promote that interfering state that then affects performance. Powerful story, yeah? So I will move on to a couple of other areas of this, different people I've worked with. So one such situation, the person was struggling in their role. A business owner asked me to come and sort them out. Tricky person. She wasn't tricky. It was just her work and her role was mismatched to her. She was a people person and all the administration team didn't like her because she couldn't do administration properly. So we changed the condition of employment and changed her role, and automatically it addressed things. One other person, we changed the condition of timing for her work. She wasn't waking up until about 10 o'clock in the morning, and she was losing 2 to 3 hours of productivity every day. I found out from the personal domain that she was quite heavily medicated for anxiety and depression. And therefore the interfering state was drowsiness in the morning. So I said to the business owner, can we change the time of her employment? They said yes. And the girl thrived and she worked in that power zone. So a couple of conditional changes brought about those performance shifts. The last one I want to talk about was a guy who I was asked to work with. The business owner phones me and says, I'm getting too many angry calls from customers. They're pissed off and he's not getting in touch with them. He was a scheduler, service coordinator. And so I met with him and I found that the interfering state for him was fear of being yelled at. All right. So he wouldn't phone customers because he didn't want to get yelled at. But logic had it that, well, if you phone customers, you wouldn't get yelled at. Right. But I didn't say that. I didn't say that. So anyway, that was his job performance. And I'll just show you, for those who have just come in, I'll just bring this screen up again and just share a little of this. So for those who have just joined, we're talking through this graphic, and I'll just leave it up for a minute. So this guy's job performance, there were too many pissed off customers phoning, where are you, where are you, where are you? His interfering state was fear of being yelled at. So he didn't want to pick up the phone in case he was being yelled at. So anyway, the business owner said, I want to stop customers calling me. I'm over it. So when I got to know him, I came to understand in his personal world that he had grown up in quite an abusive family, and his father in particular. Then he was in a relationship where I didn't go too far into that, but you know, there was some similarity of control and verbal language there. And then he come into work, and the boss, my client, would often give him a hammering for not calling people. And essentially he his whole world was filled with these people who were at him. So I couldn't change his historical, his family use. I didn't dare get into the marriage side of things, but I could change one condition, and that was in the work domain. I said to the business owner, instead of yelling at him and giving him a hammering, every time he does something right, just sprinkle his days with intermittent praise. Not all the time, but if you hear him doing a good job, say, great job. That was fantastic. The business owner said one day he actually floated through the day with that little bit of praise. The other thing I did was I set up a spreadsheet where one column was all the proactive calls he made every day, and he was accountable to me. It was a shared file. And then the other column was all the where are you calls. Over a 3-month period, he could see that the more proactive calls he made, this column, the where are you calls, the angry calls, diminished. 62% reduction in 3 months of those calls, and the others were just minimal. They were just not angry customers, just general inquiries that, because of his integrity, he kept recording. But again, we changed the condition from yelling to job well done, and then there was an upskilling and coaching in the calling side. And those two columns, it just continued to reinforce that what he was doing was working. So, Tom, I've got a question for you. If I hadn't been able to get improvement with that guy, or if these everyone here, they're trying to work with improvement in that situation where a guy you work with, you believe in them, you give them all the training, the upskilling, and for one reason or another, they don't improve and they think, we got to move this guy on, what should they do?
Yeah, no problems. Look, performance-based terminations are probably the most challenging terminations to give advice on and to deal with. And the reason for that is that performance largely, and I'm not saying solely, but largely is quite a subjective concept. And you turn up in front of the Fair Work Commission and a judge sitting there doesn't have any idea whether making 3 calls a day or 50 calls a day is a good number. No one really knows. And when it gets to the quality of work, it's even harder for people to assess. And so what's really important is that because it's hard to assess the substance of the matter, what the court or the commission will tend to focus on is the process that you've gone through. And so what I'm assuming in this context, if you've been through a management process with Ray or equivalent, where you've actually spent a lot of time trying to assist that person to meet their goals. Now, that's great to do that. It's certainly a strongly recommended step. Now, if you've been through that process and it's appropriately documented, then you're most of the way through the performance management process. But at some stage, the key trigger in a performance termination is that at some stage, the employee needs to be left in no doubt that their employment's under threat. It doesn't need to say the word warning, but it does need to be a clear statement that the current situation is unacceptable and the termination in some way may follow. And the second part is that there needs to be fairly clear goals that are set. So in other words, you need to explain to the employee what's expected of them and what they need to do to meet your requirements. Now, once you've done those 2 steps, it's a reasonably straightforward, as far as any legal process can be, but they're the key kind of triggers that you're trying to meet. A couple of things that I'd flag, and the first one is something that sort of dawned on me after far too many years of practicing law, which is most individuals think lawyers are weird for a lot of reasons. And I think the reason is because when I'm talking to someone about a situation and they're telling me their story, and the story is important, don't get me wrong, but everyone's got their own subjective views. Lawyers don't really care what you're saying. We care what you can prove. And so if you've been through a process, often this is done informally, often it's done verbally. And I can't remember really the details of things I did 2 or 3 days ago because the world's so busy at the moment. So to be able to coherently prove the conversations that you've had leading up to a particular position is one of the things that we find more often than anything else hinders people's ability to then take action. Now, again, in the context of having a third-party provider like Ray having done that process, you can prove that because you've got an external witness to go through it. But if you've been doing this internally, if you don't have proof, it's kind of like you're starting at square one again when you get to a lawyer. That's probably the key issue that we come across. The second one is not to overthink this. At some point you've been through this process, you may or may not get sued, and you never know that. You never know that until after you've taken that step. And so you never know if you've sort of covered your backside for no good reason or if you've covered it for good reason. But there is a point when it becomes harder or more expensive and more costly for the business to continue to go through these processes than it is to just draw the line and take a certain level of risk. Now, you cannot possibly give someone general advice about what level of risk to take. You need to understand the specifics of that particular instance. But in a lot of ways, it is a risk management process that you need to go through. So it's recommended to get advice, obviously, when you get to that pointy end of it, because as I say, performance-based terminations are the most challenging. When you're dealing with misconduct, did you fight? Did you punch the guy? Whatever it may be, it's something that either happened or didn't happen. But is the quality of your work good enough, and has it been good enough to a sufficient standard is just such a challenging thing to actually argue over. So that then, as I say, the process becomes key.
Yeah, thanks, Tom. Just for those of you who have joined us after the start, if you want to ask questions, just use the chat function. So that's what probably the easiest way for us to do that. So just feel free, and then Jamie and Tom will be having a look at that just on the chat function at the bottom of your screen. Tom, I had somebody ask me, one of the questions came through, said they've got an employee who's dishonoring them, trying to destroy them, take them down. Now, I've seen this a lot in my work, and a bit of an adjunct to this is that where people think they're indispensable and they've got the power, and the employer kind of bows down to them because they don't want to lose them, but the person's annoying. And in this case, this is high level, destruction oriented person. How do we deal with those people? Like, is it fair to say, to be able to have a meeting with the person, the boss and the employee, and say, look, we really value your expertise here. And these are our expectations moving forward. Documented, this is, just going over your job role. These are the performance measures. We really value your expertise. These are the expectations. We'd love you to stay, but you're more than free to leave if this doesn't work for you. Is that a reasonable conversation to have with somebody?
It's a reasonable conversation. It's something you need to be careful about. But can I just take one step back from that? Because what we're talking about is managing performance issues. And look, a lot of our client base is in the construction and associated trade sector, but we do work across a range of industries. And in my observation, construction and related employers are extraordinarily generous. I have a saying that nice employers finish last in our system because it seems to punish the people who try to do the right things. But construction employers seem to tolerate far more than the standard industries or other industries that we deal with. And so often I'll get a question about poor performance. And when you actually break it down, it's not poor performance, it's actually misconduct. So if you've got an employee who's consistently late, you can consider that performance, but it's actually misconduct. Your job is to start at this date. If you're not there, at this time, if you're not there, then theoretically that's misconduct. You can't just sack a person for being 5 minutes late. But is a pattern of lateness a performance issue or a conduct issue? And it can depend how you frame it. But just talking about that question, you've got someone who's dishonouring the boss, trying to destroy them, etc. That is triggering my spider senses to suggest that this is actually a conduct issue and not a performance issue. And the difficulty, if you frame it as a performance issue, is that then you're starting to have this argument about whether it's good outputs, etc. And in this example, the person does do good outputs. they just are toxic in the environment. And so the first thing I'd say is it may well be worth exploring those alternatives rather than trying to deal with it as a performance issue. But in terms of that approach, so assuming that you've got to this point where you're saying, look, this is a good person, they're not a team player, we want to give them that ultimatum that you either play with the team or you don't. There's no problem per se with it. What you're effectively doing is a combination of two abstract concepts. Effectively, you're giving them a warning because you're saying to them, this is what's acceptable and what's not. And although you're not saying it as directly as you possibly could, you are certainly indicating that employment termination may occur. That's the first part. The second part of what you're doing at the same time, and especially if it's drafted properly, is by setting out what your expectations are and saying, these are what you must do. You're actually issuing a direction. And you're saying, this is what you're expected to do in your employment. So in terms of progressing that, if the person doesn't comply, you're in a much better position to manage it because, like I said, a lot of these things can be performance, they can be misconduct, and it gets pretty blurry in the middle of those concepts. By issuing that direction, you add disobeying a lawful direction into the mix. Yeah. And in those circumstances, your position's far stronger.
So documentation is the key by the sounds of it.
I can't stress highly enough how important evidence is. You can have, it's like a game of cards. You can know all the rules to a game of cards. You can know whatever you want as a lawyer, but if you turn up with a crappy hand, it's very likely that you're going to lose. So that's just the reality.
Yeah. All right. I'm just going to hand over, just take a little pause for a moment, just going to hand over to Jenny for a minute. You have to unmute. Down the bottom of your screen, you should have on the left-hand side, unmute. Yep, you got it.
Yeah, there we go. Yeah, so I think looking back, I've reflected a lot since then, and I have to agree that writing everything down and then rereading it later, journaling, things like that, it just helped me a lot. Yeah.
So this is the, I didn't say this up front, so this is the Jennifer that that we worked together, and so I didn't want to kind of assume that she was going to jump in, and then yeah, I told her that she could send a chat. So welcome, Jennifer.
Thank you.
Do you want to say anything more about that process before we move back to Tom?
Just having the yeah, just looking back on everything, I really took it for granted about the amount of support I was receiving, and I'll forever be grateful.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Appreciate that. So for those of you who have just joined us, so Jenny and I did some work together. She was really struggling with overwhelm, and her the business owner asked me to do a journey with Jenny and to support her in her struggle with performing at work. And yeah, it was a really difficult process, but we managed to change some of the conditions in a personal world and work world, and the interfering state of overwhelm pretty much disappeared by the end of it. Is that right?
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah. And it was just awesome. So to do that journey, so I wanted to share that story because sometimes I was talking to an employment lawyer, probably someone like you, Tom, just this week, and I shared that story, and she said, who is that business owner? She said, that's amazing. Oftentimes people had just dismissed somebody who was not performing like that. She said, that's amazing. She said, I wish more people as managers and business owners would be, supportive and bring in outside help like that. So thank you for sharing. That's great. Back to Tom. I worked with a company that the business owner needed to move somebody on. They went through the whole process, dotted every I, crossed every T, went through with legal fees, well, actually legal advice, and then the fees, obviously, that came with it. 3 months later, they were able to move the person on. The business owner said to me after the person had moved on, I just wish I had sacked them and borne the consequences. I'm trying to ask. Sorry, I'm trying to ask what everybody else thinks.
That's right. Look, it's an interesting one to comment on. All I can say is to reiterate what I said earlier. Not all I can say, I'll say a lot more. But at the starting point is to reiterate what I said earlier on, which is ultimately this is a risk management exercise. You're talking about a person within your business who can be potentially costing you substantial amounts of money. The time that you spend going through a process costs substantial amounts of money. And during that time, there can obviously be a lot more disruption within your business. Although I'm not suggesting this is the norm, during that time, I've seen businesses where people have pinched confidential information, client lists and the like to cause further damage. So it's not as simple a question as, if someone's unfairly dismissed, well, what does that mean? The world doesn't come to an end. There's a compensation order or there's a reinstatement order. There's other forms of dismissal. So there's unlawful dismissal, and that's becoming far more popular because there's far more money in it for the ambulance chasers. But ultimately, what I suggested earlier, which is don't overthink this. You don't necessarily need to dot every I and cross every T, and that's the case even in the context of a fair dismissal. The point is that you have to afford a fair go all round. That's the actual legal test for an unfair dismissal. And so all I can say beyond that sort of broad risk management concept is get advice. Competent advice should take you through those processes, those risks, and you make a decision based on that. And that's not a one-size-fits-all proposition. It depends on all sorts of factors, the size of your business, including the process you've already been through. I mean, if you've already been through 12 months of informal counselling and then you've got to go through another 3 months of formal counselling, well, that would be expected if you're a public sector agency. But is that expected for a 5-person company and somewhere in between? So there's a lot in that. There's a lot of detail in every single instance like this. But you couldn't say that statement was definitely wrong. And certainly in a lot of not a lot, but in certain circumstances, it's better to take the risk, and that's just the reality of life.
Yeah. Another question that came through was, and this was the question: we had a staff out of work function party, and the next day we receive a complaint that one of the guys inappropriately touched a female worker. What do I do as the business owner or manager? Obviously, this is a challenging area for businesses these days. What's the course of action?
It's an extremely risky area, and that risk has been massively increased in the last 6 months. For anyone on our mailing list, you would have seen we sent something out a few months about this, because there's without doubt a substantial renewed focus on sexual harassment at work. The pathways to actually take action against an employer have been greatly loosened. So basically now it's the same as filing an unfair dismissal. It's a $78 application fee or whatever it is. You file your application, and that can end up in the federal court fairly quickly, and very much in the same way as an adverse action unlawful dismissal matter occurs. And so we not only expect to see an uptick in these sort of inquiries, but we are seeing an uptick in these sort of inquiries, and not just that sort of classic someone, touched a female co-worker or whatever it may be, but, male on male action, where someone's getting disciplined and all of a sudden they say, oh, this guy grabbed me and kissed me yesterday. And, when you sort of work through it, it's actually a bit of a sort of footy player type, environment where that person was very much a willing participant. But the point with all sexual harassment matters, it's the same with bullying. It's the same with anti-discrimination as well, but particularly bullying and anti-discrimination, which carry substantial consequences. Both of those matters have what they call vicarious liability. So that's to say that when someone sexually harasses someone, that's an action between two individuals. So why is the employer caught up in it? And the reason the employer is caught up in it is because the law says if you haven't taken all reasonable steps to prevent it, then we're going to hold you responsible for the action of your employees.
Wow.
So what steps you need to take, it's probably too late once the functions happened and the actions happened. You need to have an appropriate induction, you need to have an appropriate policy, and you need to have some sort of ongoing refresher training in order to meet all reasonable steps. Now, there's no precise formulation because the word reasonable inherently means what is reasonable in all the circumstances, so it's very much a specific issue. But at the very least, you need to have those steps in place. Once or if a complaint's made, and if you haven't taken those steps, it just means your risk profile is much higher. Yeah. The process itself is simple. You need to conduct an investigation. It's very much the same as most other matters like that, bullying, etc. You conduct an investigation, you go through, you make findings. Ultimately, in that instance, if you had a much bigger backwards-looking exposure because you hadn't got the right policies or you hadn't updated them, etc., well, you'd take it. You might be more generous in terms of the way that you might resolve something like this. But by the same token, offering cash to someone's just a sign of guilt in this day and age, and so you wouldn't do that either. Yeah. Right? So long story short, you would get advice on a sexual harassment claim. This is an area which is a massive area of exposure. And as an employer, you're faced with that risk of being held liable for someone else's conduct. Is it at work or is it outside of work? Probably it is in that example. But again, the investigation is what determines that. And there is a point when it stops being at work. If we're going to a pub after the function, at what point does it stop? So there's a lot of nuance there. But the point being, this is now an area where there is a renewed focus. And we are seeing the uptick in litigation, and we expect that to continue.
Yeah, no, thanks for that. Good points. A couple of other questions that came through. One was from someone saying that they're having challenges with a role change and a family friend is involved in the business, and that's where the grief is happening. The only thing I really, and I'm more than happy to speak to this offline because it's quite a big area, but the only thing, or a couple of things I would say, is it's important to have honest conversations framed in a way that's positive, future looking. Not going in and saying you need to get your shit together, etc. But it's just being able to say, how much we value them as a person. I see this as a future. How do you see us working together moving forward? And saying that, I get that there's issues in the space that we're both struggling with, putting yourself on the same side. And when we frame it from a future perspective and we both look at the issue together, it just helps the process in moving forward. But it has to be an honest conversation and a direct conversation. I went into business a number of years ago with a good friend of mine. We started a business together. About 2 months down the track, I thought, we're on different planets. Our standards, our values, our approach to business was totally different. And he annoyed the crap out of me in the end. So I just went to him and I said, we need to sort this out. I said, I'm not happy. I get that you're not happy. I see the potential of a business here. But we need to make some changes. And I got to the point where I figured he wasn't going to change. And I said that to him. I said, I get that if we're to move forward, all change has to be on my part. And he said, that's absolutely correct. You're the issue. So direct conversation. I got what I didn't want to hear and I resigned next day. And I've never spoken to him since. So, foundationally, I know a lot of people go into business with family and friends. And good on them. They can make it work. But yeah, it's direct conversation, and I just had to exit that business and ultimately the relationship. The last question that had come through during the week I want to touch on now is the whole area of delegation and effective delegation and the challenges that come with that. So I've been doing executive coaching for a high-level project manager of a very large construction firm. Very conscientious, easily works 12 hours, well, was easily working 12 hours a day, took work home, was very detailed, and just made sure high-quality workmanship from him in his project management. But we had to free him up and get him off the stress edge. So delegation, he had a team around him. And so what we did was we created a delegation matrix. So I had each person's name in the first column, their strengths and weaknesses listed in the next column. And then the fourth column was potential delegation tasks. And so it was a process that I got him to go through of what he could delegate or thought it was around the strength areas of each of his people. And then the last column was potential training required or training required. And so we've been on that process for about the last 6 weeks, 8 weeks. I met with each of his team members last week and said, you know, how's the guy going? Have you noticed any shifts that have been happening? And they just said, he's giving more work to us. It's great. And he's spending some time as we're doing it. He's showing us how to do it, showing me how to do it. Training, I'm about 70% there. I've got about an extra 30% to go before I can fully take that delegated task. And so I've seen over time that delegation has got to be a process rather than just flicking a task here, there, and everywhere. And to make sure we're delegating, which is a process-oriented process. It's got process built in, but it's got accountability, it's got training, and it's got deadlines. Whereas abdication is when we throw a task to someone and then we wonder where it's gone into the deep abyss, and oftentimes it doesn't get done. But when we follow that process, that's important. And there's a question come up on the chat. I'm assuming it's come through here. Now, there seems to be that a major uncertainty is to know just what performance to expect. Can you assist with that? Discussion with the employee, ? One of the things I do in a lot of my work is I'll take a job description. I'm not going to be able to answer this fully, but I'll get somebody's job description, and I notice that a lot of job descriptions have the responsibilities and the roles. For example, here's one. I worked with a girl who had as one of her responsibilities invoicing, right? So no performance expectation, invoicing was one of her responsibilities. So anyway, so I met with this, I was working with this company because cash flow was an issue, right? They wanted to increase cash flow. So I say to this girl, so invoicing's part of your role. Yeah, she said, I really enjoy it. And I said, oh, fantastic. I said, tell me, what's the last date of the uninvoiced job card in your system that you're responsible for? She said, oh, it's about 90 days old. And she said, I'm about 3 months behind, but you know, I'm doing invoicing. I'm fulfilling my responsibility, right? So it didn't take me long to realize that it's one thing for people to do their job, but if they don't have a performance metric or a measure attached in some of these areas, they can be fulfilling their role, but not doing it very well. So I applied a performance metric of 5 days from job complete. And then I set her up with an accountability. We had a spreadsheet. She had to every day put in the oldest job card that was in there. And the performance metric that we aimed at was 5 days from job complete that the invoice would be sent out. Cash flow turned around, that invoicing came back within that time, and it took about 90 days to get that back. But again, it's really important for these areas that we have performance measures, and discussion with the employee is good to ask them, you know, so what do you see should be the measure, or is what I'm assuming to be you know, the goal or the budget or the metric, how do you feel about that? And work through them, because if they can own it, they're more able to meet it. So we're almost at the end of time. Anybody else got any questions that you'd just briefly like to touch on? Tom, anything else you'd like to say?
Only a brief one, just on that change management. I mean, change management's hard. But from a legal perspective, there's 2 things that you can do that stop a lot of hurdles getting thrown in your way. Bearing in mind that when you're starting to talk about change management, are you actually talking about making that person redundant? I know you're not thinking about terminating the person, but in the old language, the termination was actually called retrenchment. The redundancy was when their position changed from being their position. So there's a spectrum of changes. Some are within position and some are so far out that it becomes a redundancy. You can minimize a lot of those risks with 2 clauses in your contract. The first one is a clause that actually allows you to change people's position titles and locations of work, etc., as long as it's not unreasonable or whatever it may be. And the second one is in your position description. I can't stress how highly the final dot point needs to be any other duties as directed. Yeah. It seems so simple, but those 2 clauses have massive consequences when we start talking about problematic change management. So I guess a good reminder to just think about, you know, it's a relationship, and your employment, like your relationship starts at the start. Everything's nice at the start, typically. You know, that's a time when you can actually set yourself up to make any issues down the track easier.
Yeah, no, thanks for that. Just one final thing, and just I'll speak to this. If anybody else has got another question, this is your last opportunity. But I just want to say this. I've just gone through a couple of days of mental health training with Master Builders. So they've asked me to become a wellness ambassador for their members, which is a really cool initiative. One of the statistics that came up in the training that we've just finished is that the stat, and I think this was from 21-22, was that 1 in 5 people in Australia struggle with mental health issues at any one time, 1 in 5. So that means if we've got 50 people working in our company, we're likely to have, you know, around about 10 people at any one time struggling with some area of mental health. And a lot of conversations I've had, and I've worked with, you know, guys, and I've grown up with, you know, in more the, you know, the previous hard ass, get your ass into gear and do this, or else you're fired type of situation. But things have changed a lot. And for lots of reasons, you know, it's a different playing field now. And one of the things I've seen some of the best leaders, and this comes from because I'm working nationally and talking to leaders and working with leaders every week, some of the best people that get the best out of their people are those who can manage to get a balance between being directive and also being supportive. So that they're directive, they don't, you know, they don't let people off the hook for responsibilities, but they're also supportive and personable. And I've seen that the people who their team feel like they've got some kind of connection with, and where the business owner expresses their value to them and thanks them on occasion for their work, even for the work that they're employed to do. When somebody has a sense of value, they seem to be able to take direction more. They absorb it more than somebody who is just directive and autocratic all the time. And it's this, again, I just come back to this mental health side of things. And that's why I talked about the conditions and then my work with Jennifer early on, is because some of these things are quite challenging, and being able to have some of that background understanding as to conditions, what people are facing at home, where their challenges are at work, and working with them in order for them to flourish and produce can be a really beneficial thing. But yeah, 1 in 5 people struggling with mental health. I didn't realize it was that significant. Last one here is WHS or HR related refresher training. What's an acceptable time period? Oh, Tom, got.
Look, I touched on this earlier, but I'd be doing a disservice to try and suggest there is a time period. There's two questions here. HR related, if you're talking about just general HR, there's no mandated requirements. It's just really whatever you decide. But if you're talking about something like the sexual harassment training in order to meet your vicarious liability obligations, or if you're talking about anything to do with workplace health and safety training, the legal test, although expressed differently, is kind of similar, which is you need to take all reasonably practicable steps. And what's reasonably practicable for a business with 5 people versus a business with 20 people, 50, 100, 500, 5,000, whatever the numbers may be, the expectation varies wildly as to what would be reasonably practicable for that person. So I'd be doing a disservice to even put a number on it, because that may well mislead. And certainly with sexual harassment, this is absolutely an area right now where we don't know that number. We just know there was a decision, the leading decision in the federal court was that just doing it at induction time wasn't good enough, right? Then they said you should have done some refresher training. They didn't say, helpfully, you could have done it every 1 month, 6 months, 5 years, whatever. We don't know anything on that spectrum of what is reasonable. So it's going to be up to the next judge to start to deal with that for the next case where that becomes an issue and it doesn't settle, which might be next week or it might not be for a long time. So that's very much an internal risk management issue that you need to take a business decision on. With safety related matters, bear in mind you've got a consultation obligation with your workers. You don't have a consultation obligation per se with sexual harassment, but the consultation in that context can be helpful, because if you ask your employees what they think is reasonable, and you turn up in court and the evidence shows that we put forward a proposition, we liaised and communicated with our staff, everyone agreed that we thought that was a reasonable thing, you're in a lot better position than you would be if you didn't do that process. So that consultation process, a lot of people think it's a chore, and in some ways it can be, but it's also crucial. And not just is it crucial to meet your compliance obligations, but it's crucial because it gives you the opportunity to set expectations and to liaise and coordinate with people. So with all these things, you can look at every glass as half full or half empty, I suppose. That's the reality. But with some of these obligations, you can actually, when you look at them the right way, use them as a positive. It can be a positive not only to reinforce your relationship with your staff, but also, like I say, to then create a framework about what is reasonable in your context, that becomes far more difficult for someone to then challenge later on.
Thanks, Tom. Well, thank you, everyone. We're 5:05, so 5 minutes over, so apologies for that. We started about 5 minutes late, so an hour right on the dot. Thanks for joining us. And if you'd like to talk further, Tom, what's your email address?
So it's just tom@fairworklawyers.com.au.
And all of you have got mine, ray@rayhodge.com.au. I'll be sending out on Friday some highlights of today, and there'll be a link to be able to watch this as well. I'm not sure whether we'll get it on Friday, but I'll send that out to you all in my weekly piece of writing that I send out on Friday. I'll hand back to Jamie.